I'm Tom from Tom Oliver Motorcycles. We've got this ZX6 in. The customer's complained about a pulsing front brake lever and we've diagnosed it in the roller brake test as a warped disc. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to change the front pads, discs and brake fluids. First of all, we need to get the front wheel elevated. To do this, we've used an ABBA stand and a front paddock stand, or if your bike's got a centre stand, you can use a jack or blocks under the exhaust. But most importantly, before we start taking the front wheel out, we need to make sure that the bike is secure on stands. Once we've got the front wheel elevated and we're happy the bike's secured, we can start by taking the front calipers off and begin removing the front wheel. On some bikes, you might need to take off the front mudguard, but in this case, we can leave it in situ. It's worth noting at this point, once the brake caliper is off the disc, don't pump the front brake lever, as you can risk popping the piston out and losing all the brake fluid. Once we've removed the calipers, we can then look at removing the wheel spindle. You might find it easier to do this with the pinch bolts tight, as sometimes if you loosen them off first, the wheel spindle can spin in the fork legs and you won't be able to undo it. On this ZX6, the thread is on a sleeve that inserts into the bottom of the fork leg. Some bikes you might find that the thread is actually in the fork leg itself, in which case you'd have to loosen the pinch bolt to undo the spindle. If you're unsure what type of system your bike uses, just refer to your workshop manual. Now we're ready to remove the front wheel. A couple of things worth noting are, all bikes will have a spacer or two spacers in the front wheel. Some bikes will have a speedo drive. On this bike we've got two spacers, so I'm just going to note which side they come from so that when it goes back together we make sure we get them on the right side. Then it's just a case of removing the spindle and supporting the wheel as the spindle comes out so it doesn't drop. Now we've got our wheel off, you're ready to start removing the discs. I've put the wheel on the tyre machine here, but you might want to use a loose tyre or a piece of cardboard or some rags just so you don't damage the wheel or the new discs as they go on. It's always worth remembering that they could be seized or corroded or have Loctite on from where they've previously been put in. If you're having trouble getting them out, a little bit of heat from a heat gun can help budge them out. Now we've got our disc bolts removed, we can remove the disc, turn the wheel over and repeat the process on the other side. Once we've removed the disc, it's always worth just giving the face of the wheel a clean up, as this can get corroded and stop our new disc seating correctly. Now we've got our wheel cleaned up, we're ready to put the new disc on. I've just run a bit of copper slip round there to stop the wheel corroding in the future. Once we put the new disc on, we're ready to put the bolts back in. Before we put the disc bolts back in, we're just going to double check them to make sure the threads are all clean, and before they go in, we're going to use a bit of Loctite, and then we're going to torque them up to spec, turn the wheel over and repeat the process on the other side. Now we're ready to move on to the brake pads. We're going to fit these EBC sintered pads. To get the old pads out, we're going to start by removing the retaining plate and the pin that holds the pads in. Most bikes will have a retaining pin or screw. Some bikes might use a different method to hold the pad in, but if you're unsure, just double check back to your workshop manual. This brake pin's held in with an R-clip, so we just need to remove that before we take the pin out so we can take the pads out. Before we put our new brake pads in, we're just going to double check the pistons, make sure they're clean and they haven't got any corrosion on them and the seals are all intact. Once we're happy with that, I'm going to put our new pads in and I'm going to put a small film of copper slip on the back of the pad to prevent any corrosion in the future. Now we're ready to put our wheel back in. I'm just going to make sure that the wheel spacers have gone on the correct side that they came off and the directional arrows point in the correct way for the wheel rotation. Before you put the spindle in, make sure you put a little bit of copper slip on it. This way it will go in much easier and prevent it seizing in the future. Now we've got the wheel back in, it's time to torque up the wheel spindle. We're going to do this by reversing the process of taking it out and make sure that when we torque it up, we do it to the manufacturer's specification that we can find in the workshop or owner's manual. Next up, it's time to put the caliper back onto the disc. You might find that with the new pads in there, you might struggle to get the caliper back on. A good tip, just to open up the pads, is to get a flat bladed screwdriver in and just prise the pads back. When you do this, just make sure that you don't damage the face of the pad. Before we put the calipers back on and torque the bolts up for them, just make sure that the pinch bolts are still undone on the fork leg. If the fork leg can move on the spindle, it will allow the disc to centralise in the caliper, and that way it's not going to go on misaligned. Finally, with the spindle and the calipers torqued up and the pinch bolts still loose, we're going to pump our brake up, making sure that the discs are centralised into the calipers before finally torquing up our pinch bolts. We've finally come to the point where we need to replace the brake fluid. If you don't mind getting your hands dirty, that's fine, but at this point I'm going to put on a pair of gloves, as the brake fluid can be quite nasty if you get it onto your skin. Most importantly, when we bleed the brakes, we don't want to introduce air into the system, as this could make the lever feel weak or spongy and lose the brakes potentially. There's a few different ways you can bleed the brakes, but I find this method that we're going to do is fairly straightforward and easy to do by yourself. We're going to start off by removing the reservoir cap and locating the bleed nipples on the calipers. When it comes to bleeding the brakes, I use a hose in a bottle connected to the bleed nipple. There are kits out there you can buy, but this is something fairly simple that you should be able to make at home. Just make sure that the pipe we use to bleed the fluid fits nice and snugly over the bleed nipple. This way we won't get any leaks, and also we won't draw any air in when we're bleeding the system. With the master cylinder pot now off, we want to apply pressure to the front brake lever and open up the bleed nipple until the lever comes back to the bar. Once it has done, we're going to close the bleed nipple back off and release the brake lever, allowing the fluid to draw down into the caliper. We're going to repeat this process, keeping an eye on the master cylinder. Once you've got clean fluid coming out of the bleed nipple, we can now repeat the process on the other side, making sure that when we do so, we're keeping an eye on the master cylinder pot, making sure that the fluid level doesn't get low enough to let air into the system. Now we're ready to get the bike off the bench. Before we do that, we're just going to double check the brake pressure, make sure we've got a nice firm brake, and it doesn't hurt just to go over the torque settings again and make sure we're happy that everything is done up tight. Once we take it out on the road, it's just worth remembering we have got brand new discs and pads, so it's always worth just bedding them in and not going too crazy on the first 20-30 miles. I hope this video has been helpful to replace your discs, pads and brake fluid. Thanks for watching.